Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a discussion about what we as fantasy fans tend to look for or want in our fantasy adaptations. Obviously what we want is going to be different from person to person. I've created what I would consider three categories that most of us fall into, those three categories being purists, the non-purist hardcore fans, and then the I know but why fans. And I'll get into the specifics of what I mean with all of those different titles, but before I get into that, I just kind of want to acknowledge where we currently are with fantasy adaptations, which is, in my opinion, the golden age. We are seeing so many adaptations announced. It feels like every week or every few days, and then we're just kind of sitting waiting, hoping that this fantasy adaptation that we've been wanting for years and years and years is going to be great. And the thing that all of us hear all the time whenever a new show is coming out or a new movie is this going to be the new Game of Thrones? To the point where I think a lot of us are a little sick of hearing that, especially when we're like, but I don't want it to be like Game of Thrones. It's not like Game of Thrones. Not everything has to be the next Game of Thrones. But either way, I'm so excited that we are constantly seeing so many fantasy adaptations announced, because what I think Game of Thrones succeeded in doing is showing general audiences that maybe aren't typically fans of fantasy, it showed them what fantasy can be, which is anything. It's somewhat limitless in its potential and its storytelling. And I think Game of Thrones succeeded in saying, hey, not all fantasy is whatever preconceived idea they have of what fantasy is. It can be so many different things. And because of the success, the mass appeal that Game of Thrones ended up having, I think, of course, that that's what's led to so many fantasy adaptations now being in the works. And that is exciting. I'm so excited that we are starting to see so much more of fantasy becoming mainstream. I'm not hipster enough to be upset that it's more mainstream now, because I'm excited for more people to get into fantasy in general. I think it's a great thing. However, as a result of Game of Thrones having this mass appeal, I think that's what we're seeing with a lot of fantasy adaptations now, is they're not really making the adaptations necessarily just for the fans. They have to find this balance where it is for the fans, but it's also for new people. They're kind of making the shows in hopes of roping those people in too, while still appeasing the fans. And so those three categories that I mentioned before, I think are where the fans fall. So while there are definitely other viewers who maybe aren't super into fantasy or haven't necessarily read the source material or things like that, those exist, of course. I'm more so referring to the people who are, if not at least familiar with the source material, they're very familiar with the fantasy genre and what we tend to look for as a result. So the first one I mentioned, purists, I think this is pretty self-explanatory. I also think it's becoming rare to be a purist, but there's some aspects to the purist category that I think a lot of us spot. Whenever we see a purist, it's the kind of person that if the adaptation is going to make some big changes, they're never going to like them, because in their mind, okay, well now you're not actually adapting this story. You're just sort of doing a twisted version that's inspired by that thing over there, but it's not that thing. It's a retelling of that story. That's kind of what ends up happening. They're going to be very particular about costume design. They're going to be particular about the height of certain people. They're going to be particular about what the sets look like, and they're going to want everything to be like how it is described in the books. Also, the characters' personalities shouldn't deviate from what they're described as in the books. I think when you fall into the purist category, it's very aggravating when you've changed a character, because it feels like a betrayal. That's the character you fell in love with. That's the character that the author wrote. So then there's this idea of, well, what, is that character not good enough? Why do you have to change it? That's who they are. So now you're not really adapting it. And it kind of always falls back to that. You're not really adapting that. You're just vaguely inspired by it, and you're using this popular name to create this thing. I think that purists understand that some things are going to change, but you have to very much convince them that the changes are necessary. And I think usually the changes come in what gets cut, because they're understanding of the fact that some things have to go, but you're gonna see a lot of arguments as to whether or not this thing that got cut should have been cut, or why would they include this? This was way more important. I think something like The Promised Neverland, which I think maybe isn't as familiar to a lot of you, so I'm sorry for this example, but the second season of The Promised Neverland, I know a lot of fans of that were extremely disappointed because they feel like they cut way too much, that it changed the story, that it was really rushed, and that is an instance where I had not really had a ton of exposure to the source material, and while I did think the first season was better, I still ended up enjoying the second season. It just felt like it moved really fast and that a lot happened. But I think there are people who fall somewhat into this category who were kind of thinking, okay, but that's not at all what The Promised Neverland does. I know some of what I've described sounds very negative in nature. It's not all negative. It's a lot of times people within this category are coming from a place of they just love the thing that they love so much, and it sort of hurts them a little bit inside that you're not adapting it exactly. The next category sounds like it would be similar. It's the non-purist hardcore fans. And you would think because they're hardcore fans that they would hold a lot of the similar views that the purist category holds, but it's actually, I think, almost the exact opposite of the purist category. So while the purist category and this one both have something in common, which would be their love of the original work, I think the purists feel like any deviations that are too extreme from the original works then make the new thing lesser and not really worthy of watching. Whereas the other side, this new category, I think is basically like anything with the name of the thing I love attached to it is great. Everything associated with this adaptation is perfect because I love the source material. I think we probably see the purist group as really negative because they are so concerned about things being absolutely perfect, but this particular category also can be frustrating when people criticize the new adaptation in any way, regardless of what the adaptation is. It doesn't matter. Any adaptation, you're going to get people that love the source material so much, and I think so badly want the adaptation to be successful, that it doesn't matter if you have maybe some pretty legitimate criticisms. Maybe you're pointing out changes that you're like, I don't really think this enhanced the story, I think it weakened it. Maybe you're pointing out things that you wish they hadn't cut or things that they should have cut, and you're just vocalizing your personal opinions. And if those personal opinions aren't overwhelmingly praising the adaptations, then this group, I think, feels worried that the adaptation is then not going to be successful because they're hearing negative things, and then it turns into, but just give it a chance. It's actually great. You're just being picky. You're not a real fan. Like the purists, both share a love of the source material, and before an adaptation will even come out, you'll have people who are saying, I'm concerned. The set photos that are coming out don't look very good. The costume design doesn't look very good. The trailer looked like trash. You get people saying these things, and then this group, the hardcore non-purist fans, will be like, everybody's just being negative. It's just because it's cool to be critical. And then therefore they are not actually real fans because a real fan would root for the success of this adaptation. The positive side of this particular group is they're optimistic, they're hopeful, they will advocate for the show as much as possible, or the movie or the video game, whatever the adaptation is. They're going to continuously throw their love and support at it, and that helps. That helps keep fantasy adaptations alive. You often, because now there are so many adaptations coming out, I think it's going to be overwhelming for people who aren't fantasy fans to decide what to take the time to watch and what they should dedicate their evenings to. So having these people that are really passionate continuously praising something is going to help. If everybody's being negative, if everybody's voicing their criticisms, and if everybody is being that picky book fan, then at some point it is going to come across, even if something is great, it's going to come across like it must not be that great if everybody was a purist and if everybody was just constantly dunking on the thing. I don't want to say both are necessary because it's not like I think people choose how they feel. I just think that both are present. Both exist. The other category is the I know, but why category. This one I think falls in between the other two. The other two are a little bit on the extremes. This one's a little bit more in the middle, and as a result of being in the middle, they're basically impossible to please. Because at least with purists, if you make a pretty darn pure adaptation, I think Dune is a good example that's pretty close to the story of the book, then I think you're going to really appease those people. And then with the others, they're going to be happy because there's an adaptation coming out. The thing with this group, the I know but why, is they're constantly I know that changes need to happen, but did that change need to happen? Why did that change happen? Is that really making the story better? They also will say things like, okay, that change does need to happen because that's not going to work on screen. Why would you try to make that work on screen? AKA me with Witcher with the strange timeline. I was like, why are you trying to adapt that timeline? And some people ended up loving it, but I was like, why are you doing that? That's going to make it really confusing for a lot of new viewers. I definitely fall mostly into this category. If I'm going to watch something, I am going to be critical of it because for me, I want you to do a good job adapting this thing that is already so well loved. And I am excited for new people to get into it. But if new people come into it and it's not done, and of course it's subjective, but if it's not done well, then the source material might not get taken seriously and you're not really bringing new fans in. In fact, you might be dissuading them from giving fantasy a try. And then I'm like, okay, well, and then that saddens me because I want people to be into fantasy because fantasy is great. Understanding each of these categories, I think, helps determine what we're looking for in a great adaptation. Purists are hoping that you will adapt it as accurately as possible. Like I said, I think Dune is a good example to represent what's going to appease that category. The hardcore non-purists, I think a good example is currently what we're seeing with Wheel of Time. It is not all that pure to the books, but there are a lot of fans that no matter what, even if you point out a change and it's a change you like, they'll explain why the change is necessary. And you're like, I liked that change. I'm just pointing out that it's different, but I liked it. And they're like, but yeah, but they had to. And you're like, okay, I know. And then the I know, but why, you never know what's going to please them. In my case, as somebody who is constantly questioning, okay, if you're going to make changes to this thing I love, it better be a good change. For me, and from what I've seen from a lot of people who also read the source material and then watched it, I think Shadow and Bone is a good example of something that, yeah, they changed some stuff, but I think most of us think they changed it for the better. The adaptation is one of the few times I think the majority of viewers who have read the books actually kind of thought that the adaptation maybe was a little bit better. There's a couple of points to all of this. One being that because so many of us are wanting different things out of an adaptation, we're going to butt heads, and we're going to continuously butt heads when we do reviews of these things or spoiler chats or discussions. There's a lot of animosity that I see, and of course it's the internet, and that's kind of a given, but I see a very different dynamic when talking about books and the reaction and discussions that come out of talking about books than I do from the reactions and discussions coming out of adaptation conversations. Those tend to get, at least from what I've found, far more heated. Not necessarily toward new people who are just watching and reacting. I think people are more welcoming to them. But there's a lot of butting heads within the three different groups of people who have read the books or are familiar with the source material and are fantasy fans when they go to watch an adaptation. It bums me out a little bit because I think that this should be exciting. Even if you end up being disappointed with the end product, I don't know why there has to be so much disappointment in other people's feelings towards something. It's just their opinions. I don't know why we have to be so angry toward each other. What one person feels on the internet, whether it's a positive reaction or a negative reaction, is not ultimately what's going to determine whether something continues to get adapted or not, or whether fantasy continues to be adapted. I think what this ends up doing is creating this collective negativity that makes it even harder for people to get interested, because obviously the people who are new to something, when they come to it, then they might like it, and if they like it, they might want to start seeing, well, what's different from the books? What are the books like? I might want to read the books. And then when they go to those sorts of corners of the internet and they see people just arguing about what they probably think is the most pointless detail, I think it dissuades them from wanting to get more involved. The same can be said, of course, for when fandoms for just books get really negative. We've seen that time and time again, and I think at this point we're all pretty over it. We're over the people who are pretentious and condescending. It sounds silly and ridiculous to be like, can we just all hold hands and accept each other's opinions? I think it's great to discuss opposing views. I just am a little saddened because after years now of having new adaptations, I don't really see this pattern changing. In fact, I feel like we're just kind of settling in as if this is how it is and this is the way it needs to be. And I think there are examples of when it's not. There are examples of when fandoms can come together and collectively be really excited about something and can have great conversations about something. And so what we're looking for is going to be different. We're not all going to be looking for the same thing. Some of us care more about certain things than others. My sort of kind of sneaky main point of all of this, though, is just to say, can we please normalize animated adaptations? It's so much easier to appease everybody if you make it animated. Am I the only one that wants it? Are some of you out there like, no, I hate anything animated. I only want real people. If I had to make an educated guess, I am assuming that the reason we don't see more animated adaptations is because they wouldn't potentially have as much mass appeal as something with real people. However, I think it's worth the risk for a couple of reasons. One, it's much easier to get the readers and the hardcore fans on board because you can do the magic. You don't have to worry about it looking really strange. The budget, I don't know anything about animation. I am not trying to act like I'm a pro and I know exactly the price breakdown. But from what I've seen, for example, with something like Castlevania, there are estimations that the episodes cost in the hundreds of thousands to do, whereas something like, because Wheel of Time is the new big thing, Wheel of Time is costing millions per episode. You can afford to potentially not have the mass appeal if you're not spending even 1 million per episode. You're saving literally millions and millions of dollars, but you still might end up getting mass appeal. I just think we need to try it a little more, you know? And something that I have found with certain fantasy series that I'm reading is I always end up thinking they can adapt this. It's not going to look good. It's going to look strange. It's going to look cheesy. It's going to look dumb. And then I'm bummed when I see it's going to be live action because I'm like, how? How are they going to make this live action? It's not going to look good. And I think we're starting to just accept right now, well, it'll get better in later seasons. They'll find their footing. And I'm like, but they don't have to find their footing if it's animated. If it's animated, it can be cool immediately. Fantasy is amazing. Fantasy is limitless. It can do so many things. It can do so many things in books. In a visual medium, it's hard to execute what a writer is able to do in a book. Obviously, it's going to cost millions of dollars to even come close to making something that looks the way an author is able to describe it. And in an animated series, it won't cost that much money. And also, I think it would be much easier for something like, I know a lot of us want this, a Stormlight Archive adaptation. Don't get me wrong. Real people, a live action with an amazing budget that can make everything look as good as it needs to look, 100% would be on board. But realistically, those books are really long, and it's going to eventually be 10 books. And if we want to get all of it, and we want to get all of the amazing details that Sanderson has poured into the story, and we want to get all of those character moments, and we want to see the big focus on mental health, animated series, you can make that work. I'm not a purist, but I like the potential that you could make it pretty darn pure, and you could basically stick to the story, you know, and you could make it look really cool. Anyway, so if there's two main points to this whole video, because I know it's a little bit all over the place, the two main points is we are all going to want slightly different things in adaptations, but I think it is possible to be respectful of other people's opinions. The other point is we need more animated series. They would be awesome. Let me know your thoughts on all of this. Which of the categories do you personally feel you fall into when it comes to what you look for in adaptations, and what do you personally look for in adaptations? Maybe there are things that I didn't say. I know this was more of an overview type of thing. And then are you all kind of with me where you feel like we need more animated adaptations, or are you like, no, please, I don't like watching cartoons? Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you're all having a lovely day and that you continue to have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.